One evening as we sat in his kitchen, I reminded Clark that he had said that once he had become a real after-tax billionaire, he'd retire. He said back without missing a beat, "I just want to make more money than Larry Ellison, then I'll stop." This was news. I pointed out that he'd never mentioned this ambition. "I just want to have more money than Larry Ellison," he said again. "I don't know why, but once I have more money than Larry Ellison, I'll be satisfied." Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, the biggest software company in the Valley, was worth about $9 billion. Clark was worth a bit more than $3 billion. On the other hand, Ellison's stock was completely tied up in Oracle stock, which had mostly missed out on the boom. At the rate Clark's wealth was growing, he'd pass Ellison within 6 months. I pointed this out and asked the obvious question. What happens after you have more than Larry Ellison? Would you want to have more money than, say, Bill Gates? "Oh no," Clark said, waving my question to the side of the room where the ridiculous ideas gather to commiserate with each other. "That'll never happen." A few minutes later, after the conversation had turned to other matters, he came clean. "You know," he said, "just for one moment, I would kind of like to have the most. Just for one tiny moment." It was one of those tiny moments when it was good to have a record of our conversations. Just a few months before, when he was worth a mere $600 million, Clark had said, "I just want to have $1 billion after taxes, then I'll be satisfied." Back further, before he started Netscape, he told Mark Grossman, one of the young engineers who had helped him create Silicon Graphics, something similar. Grossman recalled, "Jim came into my office just before he left to start Netscape and said, 'SGI is okay, but I'd really like to have $100 million. Back even further, before he'd started Silicon Graphics, he told Tom Davis that what he really wanted was to have $10 million. The numbers, they kept moving, and yet he was earnest about them. What Clark meant when he said, "I'd really like to have," was, "I will do what I need to get." It was not exactly wishful thinking. A world in which Larry Ellison had more money than he did was suddenly unacceptable. Why do people perpetually create for themselves the condition for their own dissatisfaction? Listening to Clark talk about how much money he needed to make was like watching the racing dog who had the wit to grab hold of the remote device that controls the mechanical rabbit. Rather than slow it down, however, he speeds it up. Clark played these little tricks on himself so that he would have an excuse, however flimsy, to keep running as fast as he could. It was the same way with his resentments. He treated those who had done him wrong in much the same way he treated those he did not like, who had more money than he did. They were all motives. Plainview, the Navy, Glenn Muller, Ed McCracken, various venture capitalists. He needed people or places to doubt him so he could prove them wrong. Obviously, Clark couldn't stop using technology to change the world, and so he needed an excuse not to stop. The reason he couldn't stop were ultimately unknowable, but I assume that the best and most lasting motive for wanting to change the way things are is because you're unhappy with the way things are. People who are unhappy with the way things are tend to remain unhappy even after they have changed them. The nature of their unhappiness is such that change does not slake it. The difference with Clark is that he continued to believe in the endless possibilities of change, even after he'd experienced its limitations. He was the least happy optimist that no matter how well Jim Clark did for himself, it was always 2 a.m. in his heart, and he was lying awake. Above all, one thing was clear. His pursuit of the new thing depended on his curious amnesia. His ability to forget what he said he would do next, or what he thought would make him happy, was the mortar on which he laid his endless tears of self-renewal. He'd make a kind of religion of keeping only those parts of his past he needed for fuel on his journey into the future. Watching Clark was fascinating. And the great thing was, the minute he got on the thing, his boat, he was bored with it. He was bored with the trip. Yeah, he was like, get this thing across the ocean as fast as possible, because it's going to be bloody boring. And at the end of the trip, there was this moment. The wonderful thing about him as a character is that he behaves in the most extraordinary ways. He does the most extraordinary things, yet in some ways you can understand where he comes from. It's pretty predictable in a sense because he's such a clear character. And at the end of the trip I found him looking at some drawings. And I went up behind him and they were drawings for a new boat. And this boat to him, it was clear the boat we were on represented this kind of utopia. What really juiced him was having this completely controlled environment, controlled by a computer, and I think he thought that this would make him happy. And at the end of the trip, he's looking at some drawings for yet another boat, and said something like, "This boat we're on, it's nice, but this other boat, this is going to be the boat." But this is what fuels him. He has got a gift for dissatisfaction. The question I ask myself is, why does someone change the world? Why is someone so insistent on changing the world, and that he's always changing the world and his little environment as well? And it's because, the answer I came to is, it's because you're unhappy with the world, with the way the world is. What's extraordinary about him, because a lot of people are unhappy about the way the world is that he believes the change is going to slight his unhappiness. It never does, but he continues to believe in it. This too is very American, I think. New behavior. All over Silicon Valley you found office buildings crammed with young techno-geeks cooking up recipes that they had hoped would turn the economy on its ear. The role model for this activity was Jim Clark. This was due not so much to his success as to his talent for self-reinvention. Most other 54-year-olds in Silicon Valley had long ago been torn down and replaced. Not Clark. Other people grew old, he stayed new. His psyche was a magic show, and this was its favorite trick. No matter how long he'd been around, he could behave as if he'd just arrived. At first I thought it was just coincidence that the most stupendously odd accidents befell Jim Clark. He was so wasteful of them, from a recreational point of view. Experiences from which most people could extract a life philosophy, he glanced at once and discarded from his thoughts. He was the guy with a craving for sweets, who'd been handed a huge bag of Snickers bars, which he worked his way through in an hour by eating a tiny corner off each one and chucking the rest. Eventually I saw a kind of logic in his grazing. This was how he left himself open to accident. If nothing surprising or interesting was happening to him, he moved on until the situation corrected itself. This was as true of his work as of his leisure. Indeed, it was hard to say where the work stopped and the leisure began. They formed a seamless, disturbing pattern of motion and change. As a result, it sometimes felt that nothing had ever happened to him at all. Oh, every now and then he was seized by a sense that his past should matter, just as people who have lost a leg occasionally wake up thinking they feel it down there kicking. In one such moment he decided that since Netscape obviously had played some role in economic history, he should record how it felt to create it. But almost as soon as he'd hired a ghostwriter, he lost interest. It bored him to sit around answering questions about what had happened. His little contribution to economic history, called Netscape Time, though not without interest, rounded out sounding as if it was written by someone else, which of course it was. New was good. Clark was far happier doing something that he had just decided to do than something he had decided long ago. No decision was worth sticking to unless it had replaced several other decisions. Outsider. I came to believe that they were the creatures in the world to whom he felt closest. They were certainly the only ones he really trusted. If anything, Clark used his machines not to impress other people, but to avoid them. They were his getaway vehicles. He'd been an indifferent student and a cut-up. One of those great bad examples to youth, who prove that if you really want to be a success in American life, you have to start by offending your elders. I grew up in black and white. I thought the whole world was shit, and I was sitting in the middle of it. The character at the center of White's wonderful psychodrama was the well-rounded man. The well-rounded man was the ideal 1950s type. White wrote his book in part as an argument against the well-rounded man. He believed that when society exalted the well-rounded man, it punished the truly talented, the scientists, the artists, the musicians, the engineers, the people who came at life from surprising new directions. The pressure exerted on the oddballs to be normal caused extraordinary products of the human imagination to be discouraged and suppressed. Somewhere along the line, the organization man passed from the American scene. One reason was Jim Clark, or more generally, the engineer with a taste for anarchy, who lifted one big middle finger in the direction of the enormous grey corporation. Silicon Valley hatched a lot of certifiable weirdos interested in getting their hands on money and power. These people became sort of the most admired businessmen on earth, and yet, by the standards of the organization man, they were barely socialized. That was the starting point for Clark after Netscape. How to make not millions but billions of dollars. Quickly. When he cooked up his plans, it never occurred to him that he was an outsider, with no experience in the industry he planned to invade. He felt that pretty much the entire American economy was up for grabs, thanks to the internet. Clark drew the magic diamond with Healthscape in the middle, at the center of America's only $1.5 trillion industry, the world's single largest market, and announced he was going to fix the US healthcare system. Of course, no one who actually understood the US healthcare system would have dared to make such a grandiose statement, and of course Clark knew that he did not understand it, and knew also, or at least sensed, that his lack of understanding was a psychological advantage. No one who understood the US healthcare industry would bother to try and fix it.